We know very much from recent research that life courses of folks are in part related to the neighborhoods that they work in. And so while we're talking about community change, we're talking about population level change, we know that these links need to be made. And I'm very excited to introduce this panel to you because we've heard a little bit about the role of philanthropy and so forth, and the role of leaders in helping to activate networks of opportunity. But this particular panel has a lot of experience in doing this, activating networks of opportunity either with respect to markets or with respect to bringing public resources that had been absent and sometimes had left areas back to areas. And so I think we're going to see a lot of interesting examples there. But I know that our panelists are not going to be coming to us with, quote unquote, the answers for everything that they've been trying to work at, but they have been working in these communities and have seen successes and also seen what challenges remain. And so I'm very excited to go ahead and introduce them. I'm going to go ahead and just read their bios in somewhat of alphabetical order, saving our moderator and person who's going to be framing the discussion for us at the last. So I'm going to start with David Edwards. So he has a really deep and diverse background in both public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He's worked on innovative initiatives addressing some of the greatest challenges facing our cities. So he's currently CEO of PurposeBuilt Communities, and he's charged with, among other things, replicating this model across the country to deliver transformative outcomes for families and children. Prior to joining PurposeBuilt Communities, David was the Global Offerings Manager for IBM's Smarter Cities program, and in that role he was responsible for developing innovative solutions to critical issues facing municipal and regional governments around the world. And for sake of giving balance to the rest of the panelists, I'm not going to list any more of the past accomplishments. And I would also try to do the same thing for all of our panelists here. So Dr. Tony Eitan is right here. He is currently Senior Vice President of Healthy Communities at the California Endowment. For those of us in California, we know much about the endowment, and in particular, this initiative is a 10-year initiative looking to transform communities. Prior to working at the endowment, Dr. Eitan served as the Director and County Health Officer for Alameda County's Public Health Department, and in that role he oversaw the creation of an innovative public health practice which was designed to eliminate health disparities by tackling root causes. And he had many other private sector careers before that. Our third panelist who's worked in the area of comprehensive community initiatives certainly needs no reintroduction in the Price School, and that's Robert Price. He started his education in government at Pomona College, and he's spent his entire career in retailing. He and his father, Sol Price, co-founded the Price Club membership warehouses, and he's most recently the founder and chairman of the board of Price Smart, a warehouse club chain operating in Latin America. He importantly serves as the president of the Price Family Charitable Fund and Price Philanthropies Foundations in San Diego that was founded by his father, Sol Price, and he lives in San Diego currently. And again, the City Heights community is represented around you here today. Finally, our moderator and person who's going to provide framing discussion for this panel is Solon Gervarjish. He is currently appointed by Secretary Sean Donovan as HUD's, or actually it's not Sean Donovan anymore, but he is currently serving as HUD's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Office of International and Philanthropic Innovation. We had a discussion at lunch about why a domestic agency, HUD, is looking internationally, and I think we both agreed that maybe we can learn things across the world that can help for those agencies that might be focused domestically. So in that role, he's really tasked with leading innovation and engaging philanthropic and cross-sector partnerships internationally and domestically to harness and apply best practices, programs, and policies for the benefits of our communities and aligning our common efforts. With that, Solon, let me invite you to provide some framing comments for our panel. Thank you.
It's great to be not only on this panel, but in this conversation today, and we were having numbers of sidebar. We were listening to the panelists, but if you're like me, you have numbers of different epiphanies during the course of conversations. And one of the epiphanies actually is going to lead me to do a little bit of at least an icebreaker of this room to get a sense of who's in the room with us. How many folks actually in the room are representatives or would call yourself a representative of the public sector? Raise your hand. Private sector? Philanthropic sector? Nonprofit sector? Someone who doesn't know what sector they're in. Academic, we got some academics here. And anybody in the audience, this is the real key here, who actually has spent time across multiple sectors. Okay. There's a reason why I'm asking this. I've spent a good part of today thinking, and maybe you guys have had this as well, thinking about who else that I work with should be in this room with me. Having exposures to the ideas that we've been talking about. And that struck me a lot today, and it probably has struck many of you. When Gary mentioned, even at the start of the day, the Prioritizing Place conference, that was the last time that I was actually out here and had a chance to share some reflections on place-based activity and comprehensive community change. And I had mentioned then, and it'll get interspersed, I think, during the course of our panel conversation today, about what I've called the kind of 5 R's of where you often see kind of lessons to be learned in comprehensive community change. It's not as though they're the only 5 R's. It's an organizing framework for me. I think there are lots of lessons we've learned about roles, about responsibilities, about the resources that are required in this work, about results, and Gary will remember when I talked about risk, and who shares in the risk or who takes on more of the risks. I think there are a lot of lessons across those areas that we have to think about. Let me add to those 5 R's by talking about some, at least initial reflections and framing on activating markets for social change related to comprehensive community change efforts. I believe, and I hope we'll start today in this conversation by asking ourselves in comprehensive community change, what does success look like? And perhaps as importantly, I think we have to ask ourselves why things are happening, probably with more expectation of rigor. Why does the change we seek to make for people and places sometimes, not often, but sometimes, not happen with the persistence and frequency across the range of outcomes we seek? Why, seemingly, are distressed neighborhoods so difficult to turn around with benefits that accrue to all of the residents? Why, with all of the additional layers of comprehensiveness that we add on with the hopes that there will be alignment and leverage that happens, do models sometimes, maybe not always, become more expensive with fewer efficiencies that appear to be gained? Is comprehensiveness an inherently more risky and more costly approach to solving problems? And why is comprehensiveness so hard? And is it required for transformation? So I may have some explanations rather than answers, and they may be predicated, and I'll admit this freely, on combinations of evidence and beliefs. Depending upon the results sought, I think the experience with comprehensive community change in the United States is mixed. You're going to hear about some exceptions today, but I think it's a mixed story. We do have, and can point to them, and you'll hear from our panelists today, we do have good results in housing and access to quality amenities. Depending on the model and the focus, we have mixed results on other outcome areas. If sometimes housing was the primary focus, sometimes mixed results on schools and jobs. Mixed results on all residents partaking in neighborhood change. mixed results, sometimes even poor results, on workforce development outcomes and jobs. Mixed to poor results on whether, particularly in the mixed income development frame, whether mix in the neighborhood is actually happening. Explanations, a couple. I think built environment, for those of us who've been in the housing, infrastructure, and community development change, while complicated, I think sometimes it's much easier to affect than social and economic change. I think persistence and pernicious effects of race and other barriers are hard to overcome, and we heard that from Michael and from others this morning. We heard in the last panel and other panels the importance of thinking at the appropriate level of scale. And I think sometimes we are working at the wrong scale for the magnitude of change we seek. Housing, transportation, jobs are not often, and almost completely not, at neighborhood scale, but often at cross-jurisdictional and regional scale. We heard Myron this morning talk about how we have so much governance fragmentation. It appears to be our chosen model in the United States of how we solve problems. We fragment. We have not, I don't think, yet constructed models for shared accountabilities and interests across jurisdictional lines. There are key values essential for progress that I worry are going in the opposite direction. I'm going to end in an optimistic way, by the way, if you're bummed. Trust is declining. We've talked about that. Isolation and segregation across cultural groups and ideology is increasing. The erosion and opting out of what is public and the inherent value sometimes placed on what is private in daily life appears to be happening more and more. So, with all those challenges, why am I encouraged? I think increasingly we are aligning the scope and scale of our challenges with the scope and scale of approaches. There is so much more silo-busting, cross-disciplinary, collective impact-oriented work that is happening. We see that, and we have representatives here from the Promise Zone here in LA, with sustainable communities, with Promise neighborhoods and choice neighborhoods, with Strong Cities, Strong Communities efforts. We are building much more cross-sector capacity to execute. Michael talked about the Promise Neighborhoods Institute, the Sustainable Communities Learning Network, Living Cities Integration Initiative, and so many more. We are developing more financial tools that help us leverage comprehensive community change better. The Capital Absorption Framework, Pay for Success and Social Impact Bonds. For those who've been following and here in LA know about the Performance Partnership Pilot. There's stronger evidence emerging on approaches that work. Timely that this week we have another release of results from Raj Chetty and the team, if you've seen that. We've seen the importance of place for regional housing mobility, and in this week on life expectancy. For the work on homelessness that the Heath brothers and the Switch framework gave us. For hotspot approaches, for PurposeBuilt and Eastlake. There are more communities of practice being created to foster shared learning across sectors. The 100,000 Opportunities Initiative that Aspen and the Foundation Strategy Group and others are building. And I think we are understanding more and more about the effects of gentrification and displacement, how to deal with preservation, housing production, and the balanced approaches. I think we know much more, as has been said earlier, than sometimes we do. And I hope as we get into our conversation today with those framing remarks, you're going to hear from knowers and doers, folks in the business of changing the life trajectories. And as I take my seat, I'm going to start probably with Tony to give you the opportunity to give an overview for the California Endowment, Tony, on comprehensive community change, why you all at the California Endowment arrived at that, and in particular, what you've been the most proud of. And we'll go down the line with just opening overviews of remarks from our panelists.
First of all, that was really interesting. Can I have a copy of that?
Sure.
Oh, that was pretty good. I mean, you had me really depressed.
You're welcome.
But you picked me up towards the end.
There
So hopefully some of you know about the California, some of our partners are in this room. But what we've been trying to do, we're a health foundation, obviously, and we define health pretty broadly. And one of the sort of underpinnings of our work in building healthy communities is this understanding that basically your zip code is a more important predictor of your health and your longevity than your genetic code. And so the question for us became, what does that mean? And why is that the case? And how do we decouple essentially these environmental influences that are shaping and constraining people's ability to pursue healthy opportunities from their health? We want to essentially figure out what is it we can do kind of at the environmental level to essentially enhance the likelihood that low-income children and families can pursue healthy trajectories. And the data for which all of this work sort of owes its basic kind of consciousness is data that looks at the entire state of California at the zip code and down to the census tract level and shows that there are life expectancy differences of 25, in some cases 30 years in the same city between neighborhoods. And that's just, you've got to kind of put your brain in sort of a different setting to understand what that means. When you can move, a mile and a half and go from a community with a life expectancy of 88 to one that has a life expectancy of 60 or 62 in the same city. And so our argument has been, and we're gambling $1 billion on it, that there are things that we can do to try to reshape those environments that are conducive to enhancing the likelihood that people will be able to pursue healthy lives. And our gamble is also that we're going to try to do this in 14 low-income communities across California over a decade without investing a nickel in health care. And so this is a pure experiment in investing in the so-called social determinants of health. And we're halfway through, and we have some results, which I can talk about later.
Well, I wanted to begin by thanking Professor Painter and Dean Knott and Richard Parks for organizing this conference, which is great, and thanking all of you for being here, and thanking the California Endowment for being a partner in City Heights, one of the 14 communities that you partner in, which you've been a wonderful partner. My background is in retailing, but probably as satisfying as that has been, the last 20 years of work in City Heights has been equally as satisfying. And I'm really an optimist. And the reason I'm an optimist is because of the people that I've met in City Heights, especially the young people who are doing amazing things, mostly because of themselves, not necessarily so much because what we and other not-for-profits have done, but because the resilience of young people when they're given half a chance is just remarkable. And I see it every day, and it's inspirational. Our work in City Heights has about 70,000 people. It's an immigrant community primarily, and a fair number of non-documented people who live in the community. And our work has really been focused on youth and trying to create as much opportunity for youth so that the young people whose parents worked very, very hard, many of them don't speak English and have come here because of persecution or other hardships that they've suffered in other countries, so that their children can do well. And I know from very personal experience how hard the parents of these children worked in order for their children to have a better life for themselves. So our job is, what we're trying to do is to provide as much social service support, mentoring, and not-for-profit agencies in the community to serve the community. And what I think probably one of the things we've done best there is that we've been a catalyst because we invested first, almost like a venture capitalist, and we were prepared to put our money into the community. And what's happened since then is that many, many other investors have come into the community to provide really important services to particularly to youth, but to all parts of the community. So that's our story.
Robert said he was an optimist. He polled our table before we came up here, asking who around the table were optimistic about the future. And I think we all said yes, although I think we all had different reasons for being. I'm not sure about the federal government. I'm not sure how optimistic. You guys aren't really allowed to be optimistic.
No comment. No, sorry.
But one of the things that Tony just said, which is one of the reasons why we're optimistic at Purpose-Built Communities, is this notion of how important place is in solving some of these problems. Purpose-Built Communities has been around now for about 5 years. Our mission is to break the cycle of intergenerational urban poverty by creating channels of opportunity for low-income people to live in healthy neighborhoods. And we do that by providing free consulting services to local leaders interested in implementing our model for neighborhood revitalization. This is a model that was developed in East Lake, Atlanta, starting about 20 years ago. And this model has 5 components. We work in very defined neighborhoods, usually in around 5,000 to 15,000 residents range. These are highly distressed neighborhoods. We facilitate 3 major programmatic interventions: mixed income housing, cradle to college education, and community wellness. And we do this through the 5th, really, and the key component of our model, which is a private sector-led community quarterback organization. We have 14 projects up and running around the country today, everywhere from Oakland to Orlando, and we have another 30 or so in development. And our theory of change is simply that all of the outcomes that we worry about, whether they be health outcomes, educational outcomes, earnings and productivity outcomes, public safety outcomes, they're all a consequence of these conditions in these distressed neighborhoods, and that if we can transform these neighborhoods into healthy neighborhoods, we can directly improve those outcomes. And so that's my elevator speech, and I just got to the lobby. So.
We talked earlier about, in the opening framing, gentlemen, about success. And I'd be curious, maybe even down the line, Tony, if you want to just, when years ago the California Endowment set itself out, and Robert, with what you were doing in City Heights and obviously with Purpose Built, on defining success, how do you guys think about what success looks like for you, and what are you honing in on in all of the models? Tony, and then we'll go down the line.
Yeah, so that's the question I get asked, basically 6, 7 times a week, usually asking myself in the mirror. But so when we started out, we're a health foundation, and some of us are sort of a little bit more traditional health people. So we kind of we're looking at things like obesity and health insurance enrollment levels. We looked at violent crime. We looked at school attendance. These were the 4 big results that we had set out for ourselves in building healthy communities when we started. And one of the things that we quickly discovered was that our communities had different ideas about what success looked like. And so we were challenged very early on. As I said, we're about halfway through, when we presented sort of our framework for what we thought success looked like. Our community said, yeah, we think that those things are important, but in fact, you've defined them in the traditional kind of academic way, which is in a deficit frame. And you also haven't really asked us what we think is important. And some of the things our community said were important were things like the school-to-prison pipeline, immigration reform, a lot of issues around land use, gentrification, and essentially displacement. And so we had to kind of regroup and start thinking about, okay, so our theory of change is really that everything we do, we will do in partnership with our community leaders. And if we're true to that theory, we actually have to rethink what success looks like and negotiate this with our partners in an ongoing way. And that's what we ultimately decided to do, which was to engage in this dialectic with our community partners to try to find truth and try to find, essentially a prioritized agenda that was shared between us and our community. And we've come to that. And part of the process of doing that, you start to realize that this effort is the fundamental driver of the kind of change we want to see happen is political. Our goal is to actually build social, political, economic power and a critical mass of people living in our 14 communities so that they can actually engage and hold systems accountable for more equitable outcomes.
And the endowment is not apologetic about the fact that those are key things that you're driving. And to be a foundation actually being explicit about building political power is we've talked about before, is an interesting dynamic, but please.
Well, it's just that it's the recognition that when you look at how these communities were created, I mean, they're not natural. I mean, they're the result of decisions or the absence of policy in the face of abject need. So why? Why were certain communities disinvested? I mean, I don't have to go through all this with this audience. People understand this. So our notion is that if you want to fix a problem that was created politically, you have to actually optimize the democracy in these places so that more voices, more people can participate in essentially deciding what the priorities ought to be for those communities. So now our goals are much more focused on what we call the drivers of change, the how, as opposed to the what. So our goals are to build power and measure it. That's social, political, and economic. It's to foster aggressive collaboration across sectors and measure that. It's to leverage private capital and measure that. It's to raise the voice of youth, which we think is a great driver, particularly in places like City Heights and in Oakland, where we're working with PurposeBuilt. And then finally, to change the narrative about what produces health, because we still have a default narrative in this country that health is about personal responsibility and access to the doctor, which is true, but woefully inadequate to explain the patterns of health that we see in our society.
Robert and David, I'm curious, I'm going to set you up, Robert, this way. 20 years ago, when City Heights as an opportunity presents itself, how are you thinking about what you want to see happen in that place?
Well, could I
Please.
use your previous question
Yeah.
rather than this one?
Sure. That's power. There you go.
Yeah. Actually, I wonder about City Heights because City Heights to me is more of a typical story of our country because my grandparents came here as immigrants, but they didn't come to City Heights. They came to the Bronx or Lower East Side, and they were not well educated. They didn't have money, but their children did well, and they advanced. I think we need places like City Heights. And I worry, I guess my biggest worry is that City Heights and San Diego is becoming so expensive now just to live there that is there going to be a place for immigrants who need a launching pad? And I look at and maybe City Heights is different than communities that have had generations of poverty. City Heights really has not had generations of poverty. What happens is that people come from all parts of the world and their children live the American dream. So that may not be typical of some of the work you're doing or some of the work you're doing. It may be a little different where there's almost where people are trapped in communities that just you can't seem to break through. So I'm not sure our experience is necessarily typical. But I guess what success is in a community like City Heights is that the young people are going to college and they're proud of their community. It's amazing the pride in that community.
David?
Yeah, in some ways, our job is easier in that regard because my guess is that most of the people who are in this room live in a healthy neighborhood. And you know your neighborhood is healthy after you spend 30 seconds in it. I mean, you can tell what a healthy neighborhood looks like, how it functions. how it feels, and we're trying to create healthy neighborhoods out of neighborhoods that don't feel that way today. So while Tony mentioned the kind of measures that folks typically use, and those are important to use, we think that the real end game is to the point at which you go into the neighborhoods that we're working in, and you don't need to look at statistics to know whether it's working. This neighborhood feels safe. We take about 1,000 people through Eastlake every year, people interested in learning about what we do. And oftentimes the first thing they say when they get to Eastlake is, well, why are you working in this neighborhood? It doesn't feel distressed. And that is actually our goal, is to make these neighborhoods feel like they're any other kind of neighborhood, that they're healthy, vibrant, good schools, safe streets, all the things that we, I think, aspire to have in our neighborhoods.
I'm going to throw open a question for the entire panel about how in each of your cases you've had, the extent to which you could share this, kind of successes and failures or constructive failures, things that you've learned as you've deployed philanthropic capital. Tony, when you talked a moment ago about entering the work that the endowment was doing in a particular frame and then getting some pushback, and I could imagine you could have easily said, like, well, nice getting the feedback, but that's not what the endowment is about, but you chose to recalibrate. So have there been those kind of successes and different adjustments that you've had to make as you've deployed philanthropic capital?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, our approach, I should have probably said earlier, is both place-based, but it's sort of, we call it place plus, because we're also looking at sort of the statewide policy landscape and trying to intervene in the statewide policy landscape in ways that benefit our places. So we kind of toggle between very local and sort of state, and even in some cases at the federal level. But in terms of mistakes, hey, we got mistakes. In fact, I did a presentation to my board about a year ago, which was called our 5 Big Failures. And my board really loved it, which was, you know, really interesting to me. People love to hear about mistakes and failures. So now I talk about it all the time. You know, one of the big mistakes that I can sort of, which addresses your question, is this sort of assumption that, you know, when you quote unquote come into a community, that you can do something that all of the prior actors that have come into this community could not do. And so you say, I want to create a table where people will collaborate, and we'll bring the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker all together to make a lovely, hearty meal, and everybody will get along. And then you create this table, and people are looking at you, yeah, it's nice being here, nice being here. And as soon as you leave, that thing starts to degenerate. And factions, you know, form. People that have worked in sort of government are suspicious of the organizers are suspicious of some of the other organizers. I mean, the whole thing will rapidly fall apart for you. So this whole notion of collective impact, and you know, we call it kind of radical collaboration, it has to be nurtured. It requires a lot of investment, a lot of attention, a lot of resources, and I think that for the most part, we don't collaborate well in this country. You know, people give a lot of lip service to collaboration, but collaboration is very hard, and it causes heartburn for a lot of people who have agendas and timelines and, you know, are answerable to different strands of interest. You have to really, really invest in creating a safe space for people to actually get to know each other and begin to collaborate, and it takes time. In our case, I mean, we're setting a table for a decade in these places, and we think that that's about enough time to really get some radical collaboration.
Lessons learned from investments or strategies that have been deployed?
Well, I would say, so our model is really based on leveraging philanthropic dollars. So meaning the case to make to a philanthropist is you're taking their investment and combining it with dollars that are already being spent, but just spending those public dollars and nonprofit dollars in a collaborative way. So in other words, our projects have housing authorities who are going to spend money in that neighborhood, or may already be spending money in that neighborhood, but we're going to we're asking the housing authority to make those investments in a collaborative way. Same thing with schools, same thing with YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs. We're asking all of them to say, well, let's go into this neighborhood together with a single vision, and let's work together for a transformative set of investments that will really change the course of the neighborhood. So the fact is, I mean, the good news is that there's lots of money already being spent in these neighborhoods. I was in Dayton, Ohio a few weeks ago. We were looking at this very distressed neighborhood, and the city showed me the fact that they have spent $220 million in this neighborhood over the course of the past 20 years, and really nothing to show for it. Because those dollars were spent without collaborating and coordinating with other kinds of investments and programs that would have generated results. So I think the good news is that this transformative work can be done without a bunch of new money. It's really about taking existing dollars and just spending them together in a concentrated way, and in a way that where the investments are complementing each other rather than working independently.
Any lessons learned, Robert?
Probably the lesson, if I had to do it over again, would spend very little money in the area of education, trying to get the school district to do things differently. I really think, first of all, it's very hard to change school districts, and I think we have a good one, but our conclusion was that if we could get the kids to come to school ready to learn, that the schools were good enough in City Heights for them to get a good education, and it didn't require a lot of engineering, and that we were the wrong ones to do the engineering.
You know, that's interesting to say that, Rob, because that has not been our experience. I mean, our sense is, particularly in these distressed neighborhoods, the school, in fact, should be the most important economic development asset of a neighborhood. And when you think about all of you who have had kids and made decisions about where you're going to live, when you have children, the quality of that school is the key determinant about where you end up choosing to live. And these neighborhoods with failing schools, cannot attract families of choice into those neighborhoods, and it perpetuates high poverty schools, low performing schools. So we actually spent a lot of time working with school systems to join in this kind of collaboration, and we're actually finding nationally more and more school superintendents, more and more school boards interested in federated models of managing their schools, innovations in the way schools are managed. So I'm actually more optimistic that we can get school systems to embrace these kinds of investments and these kinds of collaborations to change neighborhoods, which they never really thought was their mission before. But
I think the difference may be not so much the fact that schools are not important, it's the question of what our role is and what we can do best. And honestly, I really believe that the schools in City Heights are good schools. The real issue is when kids have the kind of problems they have at home, and they don't have good health care, where they don't have someone at home to take care of their siblings, and they have to stay home. All of these kinds of issues to me are far more important than worrying about whether the schools are because I think the schools are good enough. That's my impression.
At the top of the morning, Michael gave us a charge around not only what's our number, but population level change. And I'm wondering what, and anyone can bite on this, of what you've learned about the kind of threshold investment that is necessary, and you can either monetize that in a particular way, that there's $1 billion that's being committed by the California Endowment with the model that David and Robert, you guys, any lessons that you've learned about if folks in this audience who are not a part of the comprehensive community change business, if you were to actually tell them, be ready to spend a minimum or to deploy a minimum of X or Y or Z related to capital. And it could be financial or non-financial, but we'd love your reflections on threshold investment required to do this work well.
Your questions are too good. I don't like you anymore. So, two things. One, I mean, our theory of change is fundamentally about trying to enlist more participation in our community. So we're trying to optimize democratic processes. And, you know, if you step back and think about who funds that? I mean, whose job is it to make sure that your democracy is robust, that people are participating, that low-income people who don't speak English have an opportunity to have their voice heard in, the city hall or other decision-making bodies. Whose job is that? It's like, it seems like it's nobody's job here. It's like it's the individual's responsibility to make their voice heard. And so we think that you can't do this work well over time in places without investing in developing robust civic participation. And that has a price to it. You have to pay organizers. You have to pay people that can work with young people. You have to sustain that investment. Our biggest worry now is that, in 2020, when we're, ending building healthy communities, how does that continue? So we're investing in leadership now, and we were trying to figure out ways to make that self-perpetuating. But that, to me, is a critical investment that is a must-have in comprehensive community change.
So can I mention something? Mm-hmm. Because you flashed a sign, and you said it's 5 minutes left. Is there a way we could have any questions if there are?
We're done with my questions, and we're going to go to the,
okay.
The folks
I think
outside.
If there are any questions.
Fortunately, it's 5 minutes before we open it up.
Oh, okay. Well, I shouldn't butt into the system.
Threshold investment, anyone else want to bite on that?
Well, I'll say, our projects, we end up being in about $200 million in capital investments. Again, these are dollars that are likely to have been spent anyway, so we're bringing dollars to the table in a way that doesn't require a bunch of new money. That sounds like a lot. It really is not. If you think about, we did a study last year to look at how many highly distressed urban neighborhoods are there in this country, and which seems like an important question to know if you're in this business of transforming distressed neighborhoods. And we concluded there's about 825 of them. That seems to me like a very addressable problem. We're 12 people working out of Atlanta, and we're working in 50 of them. So if you, and again, if we had a kind of a concerted effort in this country to transform these neighborhoods, we could do that largely with the resources we've already got in front of us. It just takes effort in aligning the local interests to do that, I think.
So can I just comment briefly? I guess I'm thinking about the fact of how I would feel. I was born in San Diego. I've lived there all my life. And I don't think anybody from the outside could be as committed as people who are San Diegans to making sure that our community is a good community. And I would guess that's true in most communities in the United States. And as far as the investment, it's not so much a matter of money. It's really a matter of passion and desire to make your community a good community. And we all live in communities where there are rich people and poor people. And it's a question, we're responsible. We're responsible for the people in our community. And it starts locally. And that's the way I don't think it's just about money. I think it's really about what your values are and what you care about.
I want to send a signal to the Twitterverse. I don't know if the Twitterverse is lighting up. And this is a signal to those in the audience for the questions that you would want to ask. We have one. Gentleman in the blue. The gentleman in the blue has asked a couple of questions before. What's the gentleman in the blue's name?
I'm Alex Morales, involved with the Magnolia Community Initiative here in Los Angeles.
Great. Alex, please.
It seems a number of you are involved in investments in these kind of strategies. I wonder what you would advise other potential investors in terms of what is the message of the outcomes that these efforts can make. When we talk about population change, it seems to take a long time and so forth, but as you reach 2020, what is the message then to others why they should invest and what it will do? And the same with Robert and the others. How do we word that to capture more investments?
Well, I would, in response, I have so many answers to that question, I don't even know which one to start with, but when you look at purpose-built and this argument that, the money's already being spent, it's just about organizing it, focusing it, and getting sort of some common outcomes that are shared amongst investors, I think that that's actually a very true statement, that if you're talking to other investors, you've got to ask them, what's the alternative? I mean, if you care about these issues, what really is the alternative? So the question for us is, how do you align people who are already investing as opposed to trying to get somebody to just take your place? That's the best answer I can come up with to that. I've got a lot of other small answers, but.
The other thing I would add, Tony mentioned earlier about how these neighborhoods got into the condition that they're in, and it didn't happen overnight, and it happened as a consequence of a lot of sort of malintended public policy. As a consequence of that, the changes we're talking about don't happen overnight. In fact, one of the terms I really dislike in this business of community development is people talk about quick wins. They want to get things done and they want to show progress. And I hesitate to use those kinds of initiatives because the fact is it's going to take decades to solve this problem we have in this country of these distressed urban neighborhoods. And that's the kind of, if I'm an investor's perspective, that's the kind of time frame you need to have, which is one of the reasons why these need to be privately led, in our opinion, because politicians cannot work in those time frames. They have to see things happen by the next election. They also don't think geographically the way we do. I mean, it's hard for a politician or a mayor, and I used to work for a mayor. I spent 8 years as a chief policy advisor to a mayor. It was very hard for her to say, I'm going to do this in this neighborhood, but I'm not going to do it anywhere else. So the private sector lead, long time horizons, and also the last piece of it is you got to think big. And the reason we believe in these investments need to be, we say, at scale. We spread too much money around in these neighborhoods. We have little things going on, and and it's the reason we're not having the impact that we need to have. We need to think much bigger in terms of the kind of scale of interventions that we're talking about.
I'm going to actually take a swing at that, Alex. Privilege of the mic of some sort. Over a number of decades now, but particularly in the administration, it's been interesting for me to be in conversations just in relationship to public policymakers on that question and helping other public policymakers in different policy domains, folks in transportation or economic development or in education or health and human services along with HUD, begin to a point that Michael mentioned at the top of the morning, unite under a shared enterprise that we all have a stake in the end game. So for the folks in transportation who, contrary to maybe even the last panel, who again don't think of themselves as in the access to opportunity business, but need only look to see what transportation investment and policy has done to neighborhoods around the country or has enabled in terms of access to resources or access to jobs. So I think there, at those shared tables, Tony, that you were talking about, I think there has been a need to get everyone to see what's my piece of the pie, cross-sector, and we have a way in which we can add value to solving a set of problems. At HUD, that has meant for many of our place-based initiatives that often we have been in the lead because often for those 850 neighborhoods, I suspect that there's a lot of public and assisted housing often in a lot of those neighborhoods. So we are exhibit A for needing to come to the table, but how is it that we as HUD bring transportation, bring other kind of players to make sure that it's a comprehensive kind of solution? And I think David's right about the long view. It is very hard in public policy often to take the long view. I think it is why cross-sector solutions are going to really be necessary for the long game.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Banner. I run a community development finance company here in Los Angeles. Take the point that you just mentioned that bad policy has created highly distressed communities or neighborhoods. I think that's the expression you use. When you go in and start an initiative, why should you be trusted if somebody can look backwards and say, well, somebody came in 20 years ago and said, we got the solution for you, and then 20 years later, they're still underwater?
Yeah, my answer to that is you shouldn't be trusted. You should earn that trust, and that takes time. And it takes, what I described earlier about, this dialectical process where you're basically trying to negotiate an outcome rather than impose, sort of an outcome. is really critical, because communities, I think smart communities will test you. They'll test your sincerity. And you can easily fail that test, and then people won't come to the table, with goodwill. So I think you should earn that trust, and part of earning that trust is actually being open to saying, you know what, I think we haven't thought this completely through, and we want to actually incorporate as much of the community's ideas into the design of this initiative as we can, and we'll do that. In our communities, it took us, in some of our places, not in City Heights. City Heights, because of the price, Charities has already got a lot of trust there, so we kind of piggybacked on their goodwill. But in some of our communities, it took 3-4 years before they really, kind of embraced building healthy communities as a kind of a partner in trying to make change.
I was in a neighborhood a few months ago, and we started a conversation with some community stakeholders, and someone had come into the room and dropped on the desk in front of us the 33 plans that have been done in that neighborhood over the course of the previous decades. And so in these neighborhoods, there have been a lot of promises have been made, a lot of planning has been done, not much has been delivered. And so to your point, part of what we do is to not go to the community unless we have a pretty good idea that we can get something done there. Part of this process is about gaining trust, but the way to gain trust is actually show you can deliver something. And I think that's, at the end of the day, the communities have to own these efforts, and this is not something that can be imposed. We get invited in by leaders. We don't seek out these projects. We get invited in to help folks who've already decided they want to do something. They just need some help in figuring out a model for getting it done. But the only way to build trust ultimately is actually deliver some change that you can point to, and if you can do that, then over time you get more and more trust, and it just builds itself.
Robert, did you want to weigh in? I'll take a swing at that as well. I was in Chicago recently, and for folks who've tracked some of the story of comprehensive community change in Chicago, particularly on public housing transformation, there's a very rich, deep, and troubled history. And there's nothing like, I think, a set of residents, to Tony's point, to hold honest over decades where failed promises have been. And so when I mentioned in my own framing remarks about promises that were made, for some of those projects that happened, if not many of them, promises of jobs were made. And many of those jobs haven't been delivered. And residents said a very compelling story about, we got housing, we even got fresh food, but we don't have the jobs that were once promised. And there were any number of reasons that were offered, very legitimate reasons, but I think that's part of what happens in these relationships, is what we, number one, can execute on fairly and reasonably, but sometimes it is like there's a different set of scale and a different set of players that are going to have to be mobilized in order to deliver, for instance, on a promise of jobs.
I'm Kate Hammerback. I'm a student at the University of Oregon, and I'm an MBA, MPA who's interested in planning and nonprofits. And I was curious really about the how of the collaboration. I know I've run into and talked to so many people who want to collaborate and want to kind of break down silos, and then when they go to do that, they look at their own networks or kind of their own availability bias to like build coalitions with people they already know, and then they aren't aware of the other people who are building collaborative coalitions across the street. And so what are some of the tools that we can really do to actually create collaboration and see what other people are doing around us to create more of these kind of comprehensive collaborative situations?
I would say one thing. I don't know whether you ever read the book Getting to Yes. Mm-hmm. Have you read that? You have. Okay. Well, the lesson of the book is you have to start with the idea of what's the interest of the person you're trying to collaborate with, right? So you want to be sure that what you're not coming from something that's going to be good for you. You want that person or that organization to see what's in their interest. So I would say it's like any other deal you're trying to make, which is that you're attempting to get someone motivated because they feel it's in their interest. Does that not make sense?
I guess I'm just curious, how do you get yourself yourself out of the way when you're looking to collaborate in new directions.
Why are you in the way?
She's expecting to be in the way after
No,
she graduates.
I don't understand why you start with the idea that somehow you're in the way.
Well, I guess more of kind of the, oh, sorry. Kind of, the availability of bias of, when I'm in the business school world, when people want to collaborate, they just tend to look in the private sector, and they think they're being very diverse if they're looking at a stakeholder who's maybe coming to them, but they don't even think to go across and talk to the planning department that's doing a really similar project. And I feel like that's kind of human nature, and I'm just wondering if there's like some kind of tool that can help us like get around our humanness of wanting to be comfortable and wanting to work in the networks we have and use the information we have
I
to
don't think
expand
there's
that.
any tool. I mean, you're a human being, and you're dealing with people. So you have to have good people skills, and you got to try to tune in to, first, what do you want to accomplish, and how does that connect with somebody's interest?
I mean, I can tell you from our experience, like I said, we get invited in. So someone will call us up and they say, gee, we'd love to do something like what you do elsewhere in our city. Can you come talk to us? And I can tell you that if I walk into the room at that first meeting and there are more than 6 people in the room, I'm not very optimistic we're going to get anything done there. And in fact, the more people in the room, the less optimistic I am. I've walked into meetings where there's 50 people in the room. And the reason for that is that it's very hard to get 50 people to agree to anything. It's not that hard to get 2 people, and then 3 people, and then 8 people, and then 12 people, because you build the case, and it's easier to have that dialogue and to understand where everyone's coming from. So it's not really a tool, but our technique, well, it's 2 things really. It's keep the room small at the beginning, and don't let politicians in the room ever, if you can avoid it.
I'm going to disagree a little bit with
I
that.
knew you would, Tony.
And maybe I'm not disagreeing directly, but I think that there's an art to collaboration, and a lot of it has to do with listening up front, which maybe is what was just said to some extent. But you've got to understand the landscape of the community in which you're working. And so you've got to talk to a lot of people before you propose a collaborative. You've got to understand what's already happening there. Who are the leaders? What are they doing? Who works with whom well? Who doesn't work with whom well? What kind of brokering can you do in that community? This notion, and this is what happens with academia a lot, is that they get a grant, and the grant says you must collaborate, and therefore, now they're on a mission to create a collaborative, come, hell or high water, and so they create a parallel collaborative to something else that's already happening in that community. They haven't listened to what's happening in that community. They haven't done that exploration, and that to me is the arrogance of some of the philanthropic, the academic, government collaboratives. It's this sort of imposition of sort of an arbitrary collaborative which serves the needs of some grant or some project.
Thank you.
I'll swing at that as well. I think humility is important. And I think for any of us who either have been in school or would call ourselves experts, and you're on a pathway toward being an expert, remembering that residents in particular have much to teach you, I think is probably Exhibit A. And you will have a moment when you are in a relationship where you may seemingly know the technical answer, and they will revolutionize what you're thinking right in front of you, and you may end up on an entirely different pathway that'll be much more authentic and genuine. That would be my... Humility is something I think that is lacking for many of us. So.
Okay, thank you. My name is Annette Kim. I'm a faculty member here at Price. David, you left me hanging when you were saying that you don't go into places where you can't deliver. And so I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little more, because there's a lot of talk, a lot of community meetings, and so little delivery. And so what is it that you look for that where you can be an agent, and maybe some of the others could also speak to that?
We'll spend a year, maybe more than the year, working in a community, just understanding, really to Tony's point, what the opportunity is there to actually create significant change. So is there a real estate opportunity? Is the housing authority willing to do something different, say, with their property that they've currently got in that community? Is the school superintendent willing to do something significantly different with the school that serves that neighborhood? Are there other nonprofit providers like YMCAs or others who are willing to make an investment in that neighborhood? So we will do that before you really make any promises to anybody. We're looking at, well, what's the art of the possible in this neighborhood? And we might spend a year doing that having those kinds of conversations, and trying to understand those dynamics and decide, it can't get done here, so we're gonna move on. That's to us, that period is the most important part of this. Lots of other community development organizations will go in and they'll start with community meetings. They'll have a room like this, and they'll start, let's envision what we think is possible in this community. What would you guys like? Oh, I want a grocery store. I want a branch. We need jobs. And it's easy to collect all that. And in fact, I've been in enough of those to know that you pretty much get the same answer regardless of the neighborhood. But then you go back and, well, can I deliver any of that? Maybe not. So what's the point of getting anyone trying to tell you what it is they need if you can't actually deliver anything? So my experience both in city government and in my current job is you're much better off going to a community to say, look, this is what we think is possible here. How would you like to see it done? Give us some input on specifics of what should we do with this school? What can we do with this housing? How can we collaborate in these kinds of revitalization efforts? But let's focus on things that we can actually do. That's not pie in the sky this. And I think that's why you have 33 plans sitting on tables, because they weren't implementable. There was no engine behind it to get it actually done. It was all sort of, brainstorming how great it would be to have all these things in our neighborhood that weren't really executable. Anyway, that's...
David, I just to even follow up on that question, when you're taking the time to kind of assess whether someone is rhetorically making an argument to purpose-built, like I'm the school superintendent and I'm interested in delivering change, when do you know that they are actually, because lots of people in applications will state aspiration or will pick up the phone, David, and say to you, I am willing to make X, Y, Z sets of changes, but somewhere along the line you get to a good feeling like...
Well, it's more than a feeling. I mean, we'll have an MOU signed with a school superintendent. Says, this is what our local team is going to do, this is what the schools are going to do, the schools are agreeing to do in this particular elementary school, say. Or the same thing with the housing authority, same thing. So we will get to the point at which people are making specific commitments to deliver the work. Otherwise, without that, you're going without a compass. You're just you can't feel your way through this stuff. If you really want to deliver this kind of change, you've got to have folks who are willing to make those kinds of commitments.
Other questions?
Having had the honor of listening to everything that has been said, I've learned a lot. But one of the things that I've learned, it seems like we have an army of individuals acting individually by themselves to try to defeat the enemy. And you know what I mean by the enemy. What are some opportunities to bring all of these fantastic organizations and people who are trying to individually make a difference together so that we create the synergy that would increase the benefits far, far more than it is? What about government as intersectoral collaboration, creating an agency that is only focused on bringing nonprofit efforts together?
Why do you assume that being together you're better than doing things individually?
I don't want to, okay, I will go ahead and answer that. I was just asking a question.
Well, we don't want to buy into your assumption because your assumption might not be right.
Okay, that's,
all right.
It's very, very difficult to go into a challenging conversation with Robert Price, but...
No, yeah, you can ask a couple of people working the foundation, they could tell you. But that's not the point. The point is, you don't want to start off on an assumption that may not be a correct assumption.
I totally agree with you, and so to be serious, there may be opportunities where individual organizations are the best at doing what they're doing, but then there are also opportunities where collaboration, cooperation brings synergy that increases the final results that are gained. For example, if there are certain things that one organization is doing but they lack other things that could enhance their performance, and there's another nonprofit organization that actually has a strength in that area, if they combine their efforts, they could produce far more than they do individually. But there may be organizations or situations where that is not possible.
Well, I think in the case of the three of us, it would be difficult to think of too much in the way of, I mean, we're working together in City Heights, but we do our own thing. But the University of Southern California, what it should be doing is studying best practices and giving us the information so that we can learn from all of these initiatives. I assume you're doing that, Gary. Yes?
The answer is yes, Gary.
You will now.
Yes.
So then we are on the same page.
Well, I'd say best practices.
Well, you know, so I think that sometimes we think of the collaboration, I think, kind of in this idealized way, when in fact, I mean, what we're doing in City Heights together is we're just aligned. You know, we don't, you know, they're a unique entity, we're a unique entity, we have common interests that are aligned. We're trying to find where we can drive that alignment to sort of optimization, and where it's, you know, where we're not as aligned, we're like, you know, God bless you, do what you do, and we'll do what we do. With PurposeBuilt, we brought PurposeBuilt into Oakland and Sacramento because they have an aligned mission with what we're trying to achieve, and they have a skill set that we don't have. We don't build housing. We have no idea what that even looks like. But we recognize, you know, an aligned set of goals that could further our community work. So I think it's always a balance. You don't want to, you know, completely commit yourself to somebody else's mission because they're different. They have different interests, different motivations, different timelines. But where you can find alignment, you know, for that moment in time where it's transparent, you're like, we're going to work along beside you because we like what you're doing and we think it complements what we're doing, you should do that. And I don't think government does that well at all. And I think that there could be some study of how to find best practices for actually optimizing alignment.
So let me disagree with Tony. So not that government, I think that historically is accurate. But this is actually something I said last year and I'm going to reiterate. I do think, for all of us in the room, when government actually does step forward in a way that's aligned, I do think it's really important to actually hear from folks on the ground that that's the right move. So when Michael talked about Promised Neighborhoods, right? Promised Neighborhoods could have been completely an Department of Education vehicle, but it was designed with collaboration in mind. Promised Zones that is happening here was designed with how do we set a kind of collective impact, comprehensive vision. And I think part of the role of government can be that given the taxpayer resources, how might we, with those taxpayer resources, actually send the signals that the expectation is that people have to either align or collaborate. And I think we are learning better about that. And my sense is if we believe these things need to come together, then part of the role, at least for all of us in the room, is can we make claims and demands on government to say, what is your role in sending a signal that this work has to come together, and we're seeing more and more examples of that.
May I say something in that regard?
Sure.
Isn't the role of government...
The role of this dais and you is like completely gone. We're having a conversation.
The role of government is to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves because capitalism says you maximize your own utility, and if everyone maximizes their utility, then the entire society has maximized their utility. But as we know, not everyone is capable of doing that. So therefore, there are those who cannot take care of themselves, and that's where our government comes in. So in reality, well, not in reality, theoretically, conceptually, let me take it really to the extreme. All that you're doing is basically, you're doing the job that government is required to do, based on what we believe in. I'm not really serious about that, but if you really want to think about it. So in that respect, government should very much appreciate what you're doing, and be able to come in and align everywhere where there's an opportunity. Thanks for sharing that.
Should we take another comment, or are we done? Any last comments from the panel? That may have been the greatest benediction that we were ever given. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
All right, let me thank the panel once again for just a terrific job. You know, I think what was especially useful for me in the panel and is just to hear how different strategies can work to achieve the same goal, which is population change.